But there's another way of reading cities apart from the plan or how we experience it on the ground, and that's the skyline. Essentially, what the profile of the city tells us about the city's hierarchy or values. And for the traditional European city, it was a pretty clear diagram of what the city thought of as the ordinary stuff of life and those things that they decided and quite limited that could pop up above that skyline. So if the skyline is composed of all that stuff that represents the fabric of life, where everyone lives, whether you're the wealthiest person in the city or the humblest, more or less your building operates as part of that datum, if you like, or ground. And out of that would pop up the church, its bell tower, maybe the town hall, and its bell tower. And we read very clearly, therefore, in the skyline of the city, that sense of what the city considered to be its most sacred buildings, those buildings that had particular political significance, that transcended the stuff of ordinary life. And if we look at a city like Florence, it's pretty clear that we can read that diagram up here on the hill near the church of San Miniato that looks out over the city of Florence and looks essentially towards the to the northwest. The datum is all this stuff: palaces, humble houses, monastic complexes, church buildings of various kinds. All of that stuff represents the ground, the datum. More or less, in that sense, everyone is equal. Every citizen is an equivalent member of the datum, of the fabric of society. And then out of that pops, obviously, the great church of Santa Maria del Fiore, the cathedral or Duomo of Florence with its famous dome by Brunelleschi, and its bell tower, designed by the painter Giotto. And quite deliberately, that building was meant to pop up not only on the skyline of Florence, but for everyone around. So as you approach Florence, and mostly because Florence is in a valley, you approached it from high above in the surrounding hills and then descended down into the city, you could quite clearly see what the city valued, what the city's priorities were, essentially. There's the sacred realm, represented by the church, and the secular realm, the political realm, represented by the building we now call the Palazzo Vecchio. They would have called the Palazzo della Signoria, but essentially the town hall, the governing building of the city, with its own bell tower. And so the town hall deserves a bell tower like the cathedral does to call members to meetings, whether it's a religious meeting in the case of a ceremony at the church, or political meetings at the town hall for those members of the city who are able to participate. But given that the town hall was built when Florence was essentially a representative government, it essentially called, for all practical purposes, all members of society to the fact that there was something important happening in the town hall. And then there's this anomaly in between the two that we see popping up. What's that other dome? Well, something happened in Florence after the collapse of essentially representative government, and one single family in the city began to become very important and eventually made themselves dukes of the city, and they were the Medici, the famous patrons of the Renaissance. And eventually, as they became a kind of nobility, they built their own dome at their church of San Lorenzo for their own family tombs that essentially represented their role as caretakers of the city, if you like. So there's the skyline of Florence. There's that idea of the skyline as representing essentially a diagram of the city's hierarchy and values. And we can see that kind of diagram playing out in cities all across Italy and Europe. This is a very old way of thinking about cities. It's a way of thinking about cities that involves somebody, essentially the city itself and its hierarchy, deciding what goes up and what stays down. And that's so different than our modern cities, where effectively we've allowed essentially market forces to drive the skyline of the city. In the older notion of the city, that skyline was a place of shared values, if you like, and it was essentially delimited and defined by how that society defined its values, and what popped up was what they thought was most important.